Spoštovane kolegice in kolegi, cenjene predavateljice in predavatelji, dobrodošli na drugem dnevu Kongresa Zveze bibliotekarskih društev Slovenije 2022. Tudi danes nas čaka zelo zanimiv dan. Gotovo že vsi nestrpno pričakujemo, da se nam pridružijo priznani slovenski in tuji gostje in nam predstavijo svoje dragocene izkušnje in znanja. Vsa predavanja bodo v obliki webinarjev. Zaželeno je, da po koncu predavanj tudi vi čim bolj aktivno sodelujete in našim sogovornikom zastavite vprašanja v Q&A. Naš prvi predavatelj bo dr. Marko Niet. Dr. Marko Niet, we warmly welcome you on today's meeting and wish you to have a pleasant time with us. Now I will briefly introduce you to our Slovenian colleagues. Dr. Marko Niet je vodja in namestnik direktorja oddelka za raziskave in izobraževanje knjižnic Univerze v Leidenu. Svoj glavni poudarek namenja razvoju, izvajanju in vplivu odprtih akademskih in kulturnih informacijskih storitev. Je tudi član nadzornega odbora Evropejane, vodilne evropske pobude za digitalno kulturno dediščino. Mr. Niet, you can start with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I will start share my screen now. Okay, is this okay? Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, we can see.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I can't see you in person, but thank you very much for this invitation. A special thank you to Ines Vodopivec for inviting me to share with you some of the experiences we have at Leiden University. I was asked to talk to you a bit about how we can learn as an organization. The theme of the conference is proactive. So I was asked to talk about how can we proactively engage in this digital transformation that we're all faced with. And I thought it would be best to focus on one specific lesson that we need to learn. Hold on, I need to. And that's how do we learn from our users? How do we understand our users? We all want our services to be useful and impactful. I think that's in our genes as librarians. But what do we really know about them and how do they change? You know, what really works for them and what doesn't anymore? We've been working with digital for a few decades now, and things are constantly changing in the world around us. So, and often what I experience, what I see happening is that we often think that our users think like we do. We are all information professionals. We are trained to work with information. And the result is often that the services that we provide are often based on our own ideas and our assumptions of who the users are. And often, of course, there are institutional restrictions like funding or licenses or software that we've decided to buy. So what I want to talk to you about today is a bit how do we engage with our users to learn and improve on our services. And I will do that. So here is a bit of a summary of what I'm going to talk to you about in the next half hour or so. Although I was already kindly introduced, I will give a short personal introduction to you so you understand a bit better where I'm coming from. Then I will talk a bit about digital transformation and how that has a relationship with impact. And of course, that means what is impact actually? It's a bit of a buzzword. We're all talking about it, but I have a specific approach to that I've taken on board from Europeana and that I've worked with closely, and I will tell you a bit about that later on. And then I think the big part of my presentation will be just about very practical examples and some tools and methods that we use in Leiden, that we use in Europeana, and also some other examples, just to hopefully help you a bit in following that path of digital transformation and engaging with the users and learning from our users. So just a brief introduction for me. As was mentioned, I'm Deputy Director at Leiden University Libraries. I'm also on the supervisory board of Europeana, and I have a long history with Europeana. I used to be the chair of the Europeana Network Association. That's a group of about 3,000 individuals across Europe, like yourself, who want to learn from working together in the area of digital cultural heritage. Before that. I was director of a small knowledge foundation in the Netherlands, funded by the Ministry of Culture, helping museums and archives and libraries and other institutions with cultural heritage to digitize their collections, to standardize what they were doing, and how to confront that digital transformation challenge that we have. And before that, I worked at the National Library of the Netherlands as head of innovative projects. And in that capacity, I was a founder of the European Library, so that's a predecessor of Europeana. So my history with Europeana goes back to the mid-90s. A bit about my organization where I work. You may have noticed we use libraries as a plural, although we are one organization. That's because we have a lot of locations, including locations in the city of The Hague, where part of the University of Leiden is based. And also we have offices in Jakarta in Indonesia and Rabat in Morocco. And that already says a bit about the focus that we have as a university library in our collection building. And those collections, I think we are a good mid-sized type of academic library. We have about 5 million printed books collected from the very early age of the library that was founded in 1575. We have about a similar amount of ebooks by now, and we have world-renowned special collections. And that's something that we've been working on with some of your colleagues in Slovenia. We recently finished a project on digitizing medieval manuscripts for Europeana, and the National Library of Slovenia was a partner in that. And then who are our users? That's of course the focus of my presentation today. So obviously they are the staff at Leiden University, the researchers and the teachers, and of course the students. We have about 30,000 students at the university. We also, at the national level in the Netherlands, there's an agreement that all university libraries provide access to students of other universities and polytechnics that we have. Of course, we have quite a lot of international fellows and guests that visit us. And something that I will address later on is we have quite a large group of online users from other countries. And of course, that's something that we are focusing on. How do we learn what they are, who they are, and what they want? Now let's get back to that to that lesson. So how do we understand our users? and I think we need to address two balancing acts. And that has to do with the choice. Do we focus on the needs of the users first, or do we focus on our information first? What you see happening in the world online, in the web, in the big tech companies, for instance, they completely focus on the users and their wishes, and they build their services around that. They're interested in advertising. That's the big business model of them. So they really want to get to know who are you individually, what are your interests, and based on that, they share content with you. And of course, that's dangerous, as we can see that, because that's all kinds of bubbles and misinformation can be emerging from that. But that's how most of the information on the web now functions. It's user driven. For cultural heritage institutions, that's different because they have gathered a lot of collections and they want to find users for those collections. So they do all kinds of service development and all kinds of communication activities. They digitize them, they put them online, but they don't really know, who will be the users of these digital collections. So for many institutions, the content comes first and we need to find users for them. And as a library, we're a bit in the middle. As an academic library, we're a bit in the middle of that, because we do have cultural heritage collections. We do have a lot of century-old collections, but we also want to provide current information to the scholars, to the students. So we need to listen to them. What do you need? So it's a bit of that's what I call it, a balancing act. We need to focus a bit on those two approaches. And the other balancing act has to do with our digital transformation. So we have I think we all have a kind of a traditional background as libraries, but also I think this goes for museums and archives, where if you go back 20 years in time or 30 years in time, this was our main way of working. We had physical collections, we provided services on site, we had expertise on our own collections. So we were the ones that published on the collections, our curators did that. We very much pushed the knowledge that we have as an institution. All the services that we provided were controlled by us, and the value that we provided was very much based on the name of our organization, on the institutional reputation that we have. I remember when I was a student and I wanted to go to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, I needed a letter of invitation from my professor to get entry to that library. And that has completely changed, of course, in the past decades, mostly because of the change because of the internet. So we need to learn now how to manage born digital collections. How do we incorporate them in our collection systems? The services are very much more online, although on-site is still very much important. So that's why the balancing act is needed. We need new skills to work with that. We very much need to interact with our users and learn how they digitally want to get services from us. We get direct feedback if they don't like it. I'm sure you have the same thing. We have our own complaint system where we can really listen and learn from what they do. And our value is based very much on performance and impact. So there's that word impact. And that's where I want to focus on from here. So what is impact? And what I use is the definition that's being developed in the context of Europeana. I'm not sure if all of you know Europeana, but Europeana is a European flagship project funded by the European Commission to make a centralized approach to digitize cultural heritage. And in the next few years, that portal with collections that some of you may know, that will be developed into what the European Commission now calls a data space. So we want to upgrade the system of, say, metadata and images to a larger data space where you can also find and do interesting things with the data that's around these digital objects. But coming back to that impact, Europeana set up an impact task force already 10 years ago. And we thought about, if we digitize our collections, if we put them online, what do people want to do with that? So what would be the impact? And the definition that we came up with is quite broad. So impact is about the changes that occur for our stakeholders. So those are our immediate user groups or in society at large as a result of the actions and activities that we do. Now, impact is not something that is obviously visible maybe next month or 2 months from now on the moment that you have maybe put your services online. So these changes may really occur over time. And that's why we've been working in Europeana on this framework for impact assessment, where we can really help institutions to assess what's the impact and how do I measure that and how do I narrate that. I will come back to that a bit later on in my presentation. So what I would like to do is share with you some examples and some tools. I'm sure some of them will be familiar for you. Some may be obvious, but I think I will hopefully make it more attractive for you also to show some of the examples of how we do it in Leiden. And some of the tools I will share with you is the Lean Six Sigma for our staff training, LibQual, that's an international way to assess the quality of the services that libraries provide, and Enumerate, that's a European framework that's also been developed in the context of Europeana. And of course, I will finish with tell you a bit more about that Europeana impact framework. So first, about user research in general. I'm sure many of you, maybe all of you, hopefully all of you will do that. There are two main ways of user research. That's quantitative and qualitative. So in quantitative research, you get statistics, and in qualitative research, you try to get more feedback from your users in a more in-depth way. And there are many ways to do this kind of research. So you can send out questionnaires, polls, you can have interviews, you can have focus groups, you can do some user experience research, for instance, in testing interfaces. But what we found out, and that's on the graph that you see on the right, is that when we asked in that Enumerate survey to institutions, okay, you have put collections online, but how do you measure how they are being used? And the majority focuses only on web statistics. Now, web statistics are useful, but they're also very complicated to use because they don't really say much about the individual user. And you can see that the amount of institutions that do really some more in-depth qualitative kind of research is only 1 in 3. So that may be a plug for me, don't focus only on quantitative statistical information. Try to invest more in the qualitative information, get the feedback. That's really a big approach to learn from your users. And I can show you some of the, so this is a kind of a statistical survey that we do in Leiden. We've been doing this since 2012. And LibQual is an international system to understand the quality of the library services on 3 areas. So what are the services that we provide? That includes also, say, the behavior of staff. How are people approached if they want to make use of our services by our staff? It's about information control, so that includes collection building, and it's about the locations, the library as a place. Now, this year we had just over 1,400 respondents, which is actually quite low compared to previous years that we've had. Obviously, that has to do with COVID situation. And what you see is that we are quite consistently judged in a positive way. I think we're quite happy with that number of a 7.5 on a scale of 1 to 10. So, and what's interesting to see in our latest survey is you see that the information control has gone down. And that has to do with the fact that during COVID, many more users wanted to have more access to ebooks, for instance, and e-journals, which is, as you all probably know, it's quite expensive to handle that. So we couldn't really address that need of all the users we have, and we got that also in the feedback from the survey. So that's something that we are looking into now. How can we focus more on our digital collection building? And on the other hand, library as a place, the appreciation for that went up. And maybe that's also an experience that you have. We see that because of COVID, people as students were forced more and more to work from home and not in the library. And now I think that led to a reappreciation of us as a location. We see that now also, now the restrictions on COVID has gone, that it's very crowded in the library. A lot of people want to work in the location that we have. And of course, with the energy crisis that we're all facing, that's what we also hear, is that a lot of students now come to the library to avoid their own energy costs in their locations. And of course, they're welcome to do that. So that's quite a big type of survey that we do every year. We've been doing that now for the past 10 years, and we've learned really a lot from doing that. But we also do really smaller kind of questions, small polls, and we have a panel for that, a library panel, where students volunteer and staff of the university volunteer to do that. And this is just an example that we've done recently. During COVID, we introduced a reservation system for our study spaces in the library. Before that, it was mostly just you come in and you find a seat for yourself. Because of COVID, of course, we couldn't do that, and we needed to get a better control of the use of the spaces. And we also have issues with an overcrowded library during exam periods. So we thought, why don't we keep this reservation system and make use of it throughout the year? And then we asked our students, what shall we do? Shall we do this throughout the year? And you will always have to make a reservation, or shall we only do it in exam periods? And the majority of the students said, oh, please don't use it the full year, but only use it during exam periods. So that's a very easy way to get feedback, and that's how we actually do it now. Another way of learning from your users in an indirect way, not directly by asking them, but is about comparing yourself. And that's through, for instance, benchmarking. It's comparing yourself with other libraries. Now, I understand from Ines Vodopievich that you do collect on the national level library statistics, but you don't really do any kind of benchmarking. So maybe that's a second recommendation that I can give, maybe to consider that. So we do that with the 13 university libraries that we have in the Netherlands. And I'll give you 2 examples. So this is one example. This is about the information literacy trainings. And the interesting thing here is that you see the transformation or the change from doing group instructions face-to-face towards digital instructions, because we got a lot of questions from students if they couldn't do some of the instructions that we do on information literacy in their own time. So we really, in the last few years, and of course COVID helped us in that respect, we really moved from class type of instructions to digital instructions. And as you can see, compared to some of the other universities in Leiden, we have made the biggest advancement in that without fully losing the face-to-face instructions. And you see that we're above average there. And I'll share with you another example from this benchmarking that we do, and that's about opening hours. And some of the libraries, the academic libraries in the Netherlands, they have additional opening hours during exam periods. And we don't do that. So we have a fixed amount of hours that we are open. And you can see that, for instance, Amsterdam and Utrecht, they open up more hours. And that means often going until 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning. So we are open usually from 9 till midnight. And we are now considering seeing this, how our colleagues in the Netherlands do that. Obviously, there's a need from students also to work longer hours and also during the night. And we don't have any libraries who are open 24 hours a day. I'm not sure, maybe there are in Slovenia. I'm curious to hear about that. So this helps us to decide, okay, is this really the amount of hours that were opened? Is that, do we stay to that? Is that good for the community in Leiden, or should we also upgrade our opening hours? Another way of benchmarking on an international level, that's Enumerate. I briefly mentioned that. So Enumerate is also a kind of a statistical framework on the European level to learn about the progress of digitization of cultural heritage. There have been a few surveys in the past years. Hopefully, maybe some of you participated in that. And recently, Europeana, who is managing this Enumerate framework, sent out a new questionnaire. And I saw that quite a lot of Slovenian institutions already participated in this. And what's interesting, on the left, the 795 that you see, those are the types of institutions that participated in the survey this year. And the green, those are the libraries. And the blue are the archives, and the orange, those are the museums that participated. And you can see that from Slovenia, you have been a very active community, actually, because you have the majority of responses in Slovenia. So well done to that. We haven't seen any results yet from this assessment, so we're waiting until these will be published by Europeana. But the interesting thing about Enumerate is that there are various topics that you can compare yourself with on how you do that. I've just picked one graph from the previous survey that was done a few years ago. So it's very much about how much have you digitized, for instance, or how do you spend your budget on digitizing? Is it just one-off, or do you have fixed budgets? But I like this one to show to you now, because that's related to our user groups. The institutions who digitized their collections and participated in the survey were asked, why do you digitize? For what kind of use do you want your collections to be used? And you can see that academic use and educational use is really at the very top of the motivation for us to digitize our collections. And interestingly, if you see at the bottom, the commercial licensing of our digitization, it's not in our genes to do that. Our governments often really want us to have build a business model to make money with our digital collections. But you see, for us, it's not really a strong driver. We want to be open, and we want our collections to be used, especially in the context of learning and of study and research. This is an example from us in Leiden where we combine surveying and benchmarking. So in a few years ago, we have, maybe you have them as well, at the academic libraries among you. At the universities, we have library committees that are represented by faculty staff. And in Utrecht, some of the staff shared their concerns because they felt that the quality of the collection building was getting less. And that had to do with the shift that was made in Utrecht with buying less printed materials and buying more digital e-books, e-journal materials. And when you do the collection building with these materials, it's very much focused on, say, the Anglo-American world, because that's where the collection building in digital is stronger than, for instance, in Asia or in Africa or in other parts of the world. And because in Leiden we have a very strong focus on those areas, we still collect quite a lot of printed books. And what you see here on the left, that's the joint result where we have so 318 researchers from Amsterdam, Leiden, and Utrecht participated in this survey, and we asked them, if you compare the quality of our collection with 5 years ago, Is it better? Is it the same? Is it worse? Or do you have not really an opinion on that? And I think overall, we could be pleased with the results with the three university libraries, because the majority thought it was better or at least the same. But you see in Leiden that actually staff of the university is much more pleased with the way we do. So we've had discussions with Amsterdam and Utrecht about this. That probably has very much to do with the fact that we still collect a lot of printed materials, and a lot of researchers still prefer to work with ebooks, with printed books, because there are so many restrictions in handling ebooks. Now, this is all about how do we learn from our user and user groups. There's another way to improve your services. That's not so much by asking your users, but by learning to think like them. Like at the beginning, I said, we often assume that users think like us as information professionals. So one of the challenges is, how can we think more like our users? And this is something that we do in Leiden with a training called Lean, or Lean Six Sigma. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with that in Slovenia. It originates from Japan, from the Toyota company. So it comes from the business world, but has been now widely accepted in public institutions. And it learns our staff to constantly question themselves, how can I work better? And not just me, but with my colleagues in the workflows that we have and the systems that we have. How can I make my work better, smarter? And then especially looking at it from the user perspective. So you need to build empathy as a staff member of the library, to look at what you're doing through the eyes of your user. And we do this training now throughout your organization. So all departments, we have organized these kinds of in-company trainings with an external company who is very much experienced in Lean. And the nice thing about Lean, why we like Lean, because there may be other methods to do this, but what we like about it is not really, making major breakthroughs or these big innovations. It's really about individual staff thinking about small steps. How can I improve this? And collectively and together, that's of course a very nice way to learn and improve as an organization and the services that we provide as a library. And an also benefit is that when we talk about services, it helps our staff to talk about certain elements that we, because we share the same kind of words that we learn in this methodology. And at the right bottom, you see the Kaizen. That's a Japanese word for constant improvement. And that's a key concept in Lean training. One of the really nice elements, I think, of working with Lean is that it focuses on waste. And waste is a bit of maybe a strange word to use. It has to do with, where are in your workflows, in the way that you work, what could be improved? And for instance, we could have talent in the organization that we don't really use because we make people do things, and they may have talents and they are underused or unused as an organization. But it could also be that we have a workflow where there's a lot of waiting involved. So one colleague finishes something and then it takes some time for another colleague to be able to pick that up again. So you look at those kinds of wastes to reduce that, to make it more lean, to make it more practical, and to make the work smarter. The staff is really enthusiastic about this. So we have some really good examples in the organization where we try to make it easier for the staff to learn about what they do. So it's not an automated process for them. They constantly ask themselves, okay, so why am I doing this? And I think that's a very good way to learn as an organization as well. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, we have a new digital user group as an academic library. And probably that's for us the biggest challenge. I share with you here the web statistics of our, what we call digital collections service. So we have about 500,000 objects in our collections digitized at the moment. And as you can see, our biggest user group comes from Indonesia, on the online user group. That's because we have fantastic collections. We have the largest collection on Indonesia outside Indonesia. And we have a very active digitization policy for that. So we have lots of great objects, prints, graph, audio, objects that we digitize. And you see that in the visits that we have. But these are people that will never set foot in our library in Leiden. So who are they? And they can be researchers, they can be private persons, we don't know that. So that's something that we are currently thinking about. As I mentioned, we do have an office in Jakarta, so that's a good gateway for us to that. So we're currently thinking what kind of user surveys, what kind of research can we do in Indonesia to know, what's the impact that we make on our users in Indonesia? What kind of expectations do they have from us? We try to make our collections as much available via the catalog, but of course, even the catalog description for them is not very helpful if they cannot see the document as a digitized item. So we can base our priorities for digitization, for instance, based on the feedback that we get for them. We haven't done that yet, so that's still part of the learning process that we have in Leiden. So that's something that we have as our policy for the next couple of years. And one of the ways that we do that, and that's the final example that I want to give to you, that's that impact framework that I mentioned before to you about Europeana. So this is something that's been building in the past 10 years. And it's not just a document or a method, there's also a community. And I think this is really one of the strongest parts of why I'm so attracted to work with Europeana. It's not about the Europeana Foundation or the staff that works there, it's about us. It's about us as a community. And this impact community, it's about 1,000 people who are working together, thinking together, how can we make this better? How can we make better use of the knowledge that we have of our users, of the feedback that we get from our users with our digital collections? And Europeana, the community, developed what we call an impact playbook. And I will show you that on my next screen. And there are 4 phases in that playbook. And these are all free to download for you. So if you don't know about this, I invite you to have a look at that. So the 4 phases of understanding impact, and I think this is really a helpful way to do that, is to how do you prepare your organization for impact assessment? And I will share an example of how we've done that in Leiden after this. The second phase is about measuring that impact. So what kind of data do you collect from your users to understand that impact? The third phase is how do you show what you've learned from that measurement of impact? How do you narrate that? How do you tell in blogs or in reports or other ways? How do you show what the impact you've had? And finally, the fourth phase is how do you evaluate what you've done so far? And that's why it's a continuous loop, because of course you learn again from the evaluation, and then you can start thinking about, okay, is there another user group maybe I want to learn about, or maybe your user group has evolved. You see that with students every year, the students who were getting more and more digital in the way that they were brought up, that brings changes for us in our services. This is an example of what we've done in Leiden. So just before COVID emerged, I organized a workshop in my organization, in my library, where we did that first phase. How do we prepare for impact assessment? And one of the key tools that's been developed in the Europeana Impact Framework is the change pathway. This is based on the theory of change. Maybe some of you have heard about it. And it's a very elegant, simple way to look at different components that are involved in creating impact. And this pathway, the interesting thing is something that we've learned in this Europeana community. Our natural way to think is from the left to the right. So who are our stakeholders? For instance, students. What are our resources? That could be material like textbooks or ebooks, or funding. It could be money. We could do a project where we maybe, for students, where we maybe have project funding. And then what are the activities that we do with that? What does that generate? That's the output. And that will be the output that we generate. That could be a service, or that could be a collection, that will have some outcomes. For instance, the students have an immediate access to type of literature that wasn't available before. And then after that, there will be, hopefully, because the students have learned, they have read the textbooks, they have learned from it, they develop themselves as professionals, and that's the impact. So we contribute to them becoming, a very good researcher. That could be an impact. And that's usually how many of us think. The interesting thing about the change pathway is try to do it the other way. Start at the right end of the pathway. So think first about what's the impact that you want to have. So we want our students to be, good citizens and good researchers and really contribute to a positive development of the country on an academic level. And then going back from the right to the left, you may end up with completely different ideas of what you actually want to do. So not thinking inside out, but thinking outside in. I think that's how the empathy is being developed in our staff. Not think from the logic of us as a library, but think from the logic of the user groups. And what does that mean for us? What do we need to change to make that outcome and impact in the longer term better for them? So this is really a big lesson. And I think some of my colleagues really enjoyed this. So I see in some of the projects that we do, I see these tools emerging in the project teams. Now, let me conclude. I have some recommendations to sum up a bit what we've done. So a key element, I think, a key message in what I want to share with you is work on continuous improvement. Don't take for granted what you do now, today, will be the same next year. It's about constantly evolving in how we work. And don't use the logic of your organization. This is just how we do it. I hear that sometimes my colleagues say, this is how we've done it in the past 10 years. So there's no reason to change that. But there may be a reason to change that. And you will see that reason once you make that shift and you show that kind of empathy to think like a user and look through the eyes of your users. Now, the second recommendation, of course, is, as I've shown some examples, do some surveying, not only just with statistics, but try to also focus on qualitative kind of surveys. But we all know, I'm sure you get the same thing as I, every day, whenever I've bought something, there's a survey or a questionnaire, what do you think of our services? So we need to really think wisely when to use it. And of course, part of that is what's in it for the person that contributes to the survey. So don't overdo it, do it wisely, but still, I think it's very good to make use of that tool because that's the direct way to get feedback from your users. And a third recommendation would be then, if you don't do that, benchmark yourself with your peer institutions. Look for topics that you want to learn from how other institutions similar to you in your country or internationally, how they perform and what you can learn from them. And don't do that in a one-off, but do that at regular intervals. And then two more recommendations that I want to share with you. So we're all faced with this digital transformation, but don't consider this transformation. I don't really like that word transformation because we're not going from A to B. It's about finding that balancing act. We need to fully incorporate digital with physical. I think that's the way we as libraries and service providers really have to develop ourselves. And we can only do that if we really involve our user groups, if we talk to them, if we see what works, if we try to understand what doesn't work for them, and also how they, year after year, how they assess what we do, how they value what we do. And a very practical recommendation I can give to you. Hopefully, I may have raised some interest for the impact work that's being done by Europeana. So you can join the impact community. It's free. There's no fee. It's a really fantastic group of people to work with. You can download the impact playbook. It's very well written. There's a lot of very practical tools. If you want to set up a workshop in your organization with your staff, there are all kinds of practical ways and advices on how to do that. And of course, next week, there will be the Europeana conference where also the impact community will be present and be sharing something where we will discuss the impact of what we do at the European level in the context of our digital transformation. So that will be my final message to you. Just do it, be proactive, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Marco de Niet, for your presentation. Now I will ask you, when you started measuring impact, what was the biggest change within the library? Did the librarians see the benefit of measuring impact? Was there resistance?
Yeah, I think resistance is something that's part of that lean training that we're doing. That's the reasons why we do it, because of course, we see that there's resistance. It's about opening up to look at your work in a different way, and that always comes with resistance. People have very clear ideas, and sometimes they have done their work. They sometimes think they're being criticized for not doing it properly in the past years, and that's not, of course, what we mean to say. So it's not about having done things wrong, but maybe doing things in a different way where we can include the perspective of the user more than we have done before. A lot of the things that you do as a library, they're, for instance, the metadata formats that we use. We've all conceived them ourselves. We all made that up, and sometimes that goes back over a century when we came up with some of the ways of working that we have done. And of course, that's part of the profession. We're all professionals, so we like to think we know what's best. And it's not about dismissing that expertise, and that it's about more enriching it with a new perspective. And it takes time. Like I said, we've been working this impact community already now 10 years. And in my library, we've been working on this now, so from 4 or 5 years. We do these lean trainings now also for new staff. And it really takes time for it to land and to start working together on it. But we see progress there. So one of the things we've done is not do the training per department in the library. So recently we have invited staff across departments, and they all say, we talk just not enough to each other across departments. So they find it very useful to be together in this kind of training.
Thank you. Lately, we see that instead of the students, the parents come to library to ask about their children project and collect data. How to encourage parents and students to be more independent in that sense? Thank you.
Okay. That's not something that I recognize from my library, so I find that a bit difficult to answer that, because most of the students that we have, we don't see parents coming. We do have sometimes parents visiting with students from secondary education who want to come to Leiden, so sometimes we grant them access to the library. We have an age limit in the library. You need to be 18 or over, so our library is not really available for students of secondary education, because they need to go to the public library and not to our library. So I'm not really sure. I haven't thought about this yet. So I'm sorry, I can't really give a good answer to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I will ask you, in which direction goes the main development of the library services of Leiden University Libraries?
Yeah. Well, like I said, also in the context of that lean training, it will be gradually. I think the need for more digital services will be bigger. One of the big changes, of course, after COVID is that staff work more remotely from home. So a lot of the licensing that we have on the databases, for instance, that's a campus license, and that requires staff to work on the campus. But now that people are working more from home, we need to rethink that, and that we could either do that by changing licenses, or maybe think about different ways of authentication. We need to negotiate that with the publishers and the service providers of databases that we buy. I don't think that will be a quick change. I think there will still be quite a lot of dissatisfaction with the staff about access to a lot of the digital services because of the restrictions that come with the licenses that we buy. But I think that will be one direction. And the other direction, of course, is open access. So we are a very a proactive library when it comes to publishing our academic literature, our academic publications from the university staff in open access. Just yesterday, the new figures were published in the Netherlands, how we do. And you may have heard of Coalition S and Plan S. So that means that the big funders of academic research, they oblige the researchers to publish their information open access on the first day of publication. Now, this may be not the policy of a publisher of a big journal, because sometimes they need to have a grace period of 6 months or longer, where the article will not be available for the public unless you have a paid subscription to the publisher. So we're very much pushing our researchers to publish in open access. And I think I can say that the Netherlands is one of the front runners in that. And that's a bit of a disadvantage, of course, because open access will only work if the full international community, including America, including China, will really open up like that. But I think it's inevitable that we develop our services in that direction. And that also means, how do you make open access articles findable if they are not our own Leiden University articles? They are in our repository. But how do you make open access articles visible to users that are published elsewhere? I think that's also one of the challenges, but definitely a development that we will see happening.
Artificial intelligence is increasingly becoming a part of everyday life. Where do you see us librarians? Will artificial intelligence displace us?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. We're not very advanced with that in Leiden, but we have some experiment. We've done some experiments with that, especially in the context of our digitized special collections. I think it's really interesting to find a balance between using the data through digital intelligence and, for instance, the privacy regulations in that respect. So that's maybe why we're a bit cautious about it. But I can give you an example, what we've done together with Oxford University. We have a large collection of photographs taken about a century ago in the Middle East from a Dutchman who traveled across the Middle East. He took thousands of pictures there. We have them in original and in negatives, and we digitized them, but the metadata was very poor of that. And in Oxford University, they developed, based on artificial intelligence, a system that could recognize the image of a photo. And what we've done is we compared the negatives with the prints of the photos that we had. And the description of the negatives were a bit better than the descriptions of the photograph. So because of this artificial intelligence approach, we could identify a lot more of the photos that had no metadata at all and include the metadata of the negative to that. So that's a first step that we've taken in this direction. I think there's much more to be done in the terms of data sets. And I think that's very interesting also in the context of Europeana. The need, you see the need growing for not having access to individual objects, but to really large data sets to do your own research. And I think artificial intelligence is really a tool for us to think about how do we create these data sets? Do we publish them as we think that they should be? Again, that comes back to the question, what do our users want? Now, we could publish a data set based on one collection, but maybe that collection is not what the user is interested in. So artificial intelligence can help us make semantic connections across data sets and provide a user with a specific data set that he wants to use in her or his research. So yes, I think there are really great ways to open it up, provided that we really handle this question of the GDPR guidelines well. I think this is probably for all of us a bit of a challenge at this point in time.
And the last one, what is, in your opinion, the ultimate proactive role of a librarian? Yeah,
that's a very good and very broad question. Of course, that I think this touches upon the essence of who we are and what we do. My perspective on this, and maybe that's more of a personal, perhaps than a professional answer. I think we all see that information, because of the internet, has grown so widely, and so many positive and negative elements in that. And so, you know, it's something called the information society. We're living in an information society. What I find a bit puzzling or difficult to really understand is why the education of what we've learned as librarians is getting less and less and less in institutions. So there's no library education anymore in the Netherlands. While you think the assessment of what information is, that's so key to how the information society works. So I think we need to reinvent ourselves. Maybe not just, you know, we're still thinking like museums and archives and libraries. Maybe we need to let go of that concept of a library, of a museum, of an archive. And that's why I quite like that word information professional, because I think we all have, in the digital world, if a collection is digitized by a museum or an archive or a library, or if it's new content or old content, I think that all merges into, from the user perspective, it becomes a big information space, a big data space. So I think that the way that we engage with data, how we provide our citizens and our researchers with knowledge about how to manage data, how to deal with that, how to use it, how to store it, how to keep it available over longer periods of time. I think that's the key thing that we will, how we will develop ourselves as a librarian.
Dr. Marco, thank you for being our guest and for so many ideas that we can use for our work.